I'm going to hand back over to Jane now, who's going to bring it all together in terms of the panel discussion. So thanks, Jane.
Okay, thank you, Anya. Thank you. And I'm just going to share my screen again. So I've got a slide just to introduce again our panel members. You heard from them all earlier this morning, so I think they don't need any introduction. But it's great that we've all come back together. So I've got Katie, Samantha, Michelle and Hardy joining us, and I've really enjoyed this morning a huge amount. And I think what I wanted to just pick up and sort of as a kind of open question for our panel. So at the event we did in Liverpool last year, we picked out 4 themes from the ACRL report that was written in 2013, and I think those themes were things I sort of just wanted to highlight to our panel, and maybe if we go to them each in turn to just say a few words about what sort of might resonate with them. But in the ACRL report, they said that integrating pedagogy and scholarly communication into educational programs, so librarians, so actually making sure that librarians were trained at library school to understand all these issues was a really important thing. To also develop new information literacy curricula that brought in both, aspects of pedagogy, but also open access scholarly comms. And we've heard examples of how people are doing that already in Ireland, which is great. Explore some options for organisational change. We had quite a lot of discussions about how teams were structured and whether that was helping or hindering. And I think, we're all aware with the new way of working, it is sometimes harder to break down the silos, but maybe in other ways it's easier because events can be more open. And then, and I think Harvey touched a bit on this as well, but also Michelle, about advocacy and, how we can sort of use some of this work to advocate for change in areas to do with copyright, scholarly communications, access to scientific information. So those were some things that sort of struck me. And I guess to each of the panel, and I'll kind of maybe suggest we go in the order that I had you on the slide. So go to Kate first, and Samantha, then Michelle, then Hardy. Do you have any sort of examples or evidence of how the information literacy and scholarly communication might be working together better in your institution? Do you think it presents any specific challenges? And is there anything else that you'd kind of like to share? So I don't know, Katie, would you like to say something first?
Thanks, Jane. So I think I might start at the bottom of your list with the point around advocacy, because I found both Michelle and Hardy's presentations really helpful on this. I'm thinking about what I was thinking about was what gets engagement, and because sometimes we offer training and workshops and events and opportunities, and they don't necessarily get the engagement that we had hoped for, and whether there's things we can learn around what are the hooks that do catch people's interest and do get that engagement, and the open scholarship communities enabling them to be researcher-led, I think, is one good way to get that engagement. And I'd be interested to know if the other panelists have thoughts on that, or tips around what's worked in terms of what are the things that do catch people's eye and do get that interest. The other point to pick up on perhaps was, you mentioned organisational change, and I had interpreted that sort of more broadly, not just within the library but within our universities as a whole, and what helps with organisational change. In my experience, making the most of external drivers, so when there are requirements from funding organisations or from research assessment exercises, that sort of thing, to be able to use those and to present those as it helps to get something that is just generally desirable up to the top of the priority list with a deadline, and that helps to actually get things to happen. But the other thing that struck me there, just listening to Hardy's presentation again, about that the image Hardy used from the cultural change model and the user experience level, making it easy. I think this is one, particularly with that I've been talking about with research evaluation, at the moment it's not easy. So if we can find ways to make this easy, that would be really helpful. So I'm a bit scattered here, but one perhaps practical thing, one thing we're thinking about doing at the moment, and you mentioned, Jane, the way that within libraries we've perhaps become a bit siloed between teaching specialists and research specialists, and realised that our research services team, we started off as just one person on a secondment for a year, and now we're quite a big team, and maybe we haven't set up the formal communication channels within the library as well as we might, because we used to rely just on informal bumping into each other in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, and particularly at the moment where most of us are working from home, really missing those informal connections. So it's starting to think about whether we could perhaps map out what the different communication channels each of us has access to, and make sure that there's a library presence in all of those different departmental meetings, research committee meetings, student connections, and making sure that we're sharing key messages between us so that people get those consistent messages and hear them in different places. We made a big effort with that around open access, and just 3 key steps to open access. I think it's a strategy we could use more widely.
Okay, thanks very much, Katie. That's great. Samantha, can we go over to you? Is there anything you'd like to comment on with regard to any of those sort of points, or anything further?
It's a little bit difficult for me because I don't come from inside the academic community, so it's slightly different. One of the comments that came up on the Twitter feed was around the fact that it's more important than ever, sorry, I'm turning away to read it, for librarians to understand both how copyright law works itself as well as how the licenses and exceptions fit in. And the comment is made that the default has often been in the past just go no. It's too much to understand, so we won't use it, we won't do it, we won't. So that's what we want to change, and that's what I would like to help with, that change in the best way we can. We would love to partner with people who are interested in this area. Now, I know traditionally it's been possible to get copyright on the agenda, particularly in the library, in the education community around library education studies, when you've had something fun to talk about, like the Google Books project. I did a number of guest lectures on library and information systems master's courses in the 2010s, early 2010s, because it was fun stuff to talk about and challenging, and it created that interest. So we would be really happy to help the library community, the educational library community, and the wider academic community to talk and have fun with copyright, because it can be fun, and you know this. It can be made to be interesting and fun and a learning curve. So I think I'm really interested in following up with you on the copyright game and on things that we can do to help. But we're outside of this community in some ways, but we would like to be able to partner with you in a much better way. And I think the amendment to copyright law in 2019 makes it easier because it is more technologically friendly. So we're doing less of the no, and we're doing much more of the yes, you can do this. And we need to get that conversation going. There's also a lot going on at EU level outside of OER and outside of open work. There's also the Digital Education Action Plan coming up. There's the Digital Services Act coming up. So there's a lot more to happen around this conversation of how to make copyright more user-friendly and still protect the rights holders' interests where they need to be still protected. Organizations like myself, will we be around in 20 years? I honestly don't know. But at the moment, we are certainly there to facilitate that transition from closed to open, because we are able to license that backlist that will remain closed no matter how fast the open movement works. So we would like to be there to support you as best we can. So that's really what I can offer, not coming from an academic organizational perspective, but we're certainly very open to supporting the sector in whatever way we can.
Thank you, Samantha. It's really helpful. Yeah, it sounds like you're doing a very similar things to what happening in the UK with our CLA as well. Michelle, can I go over to you? Would you like to comment on anything from the ACRL report, or anything that, examples? You've already shared some examples as well, but just to give you a chance to say a few more words.
Sure, yeah. So actually in my talk, I'm quite conscious that I was very much talking about embedding scholarly communications in information literacy, but I think it works the other way as well. So, you know, those of us working in the research space have an awful lot to learn from our colleagues in the information literacy space and you know, liaison librarians and that side of things, because I think they bring with them a lot of the disciplinary expertise and understanding of, you know, the disciplinary differences, and also they bring with them a lot of relationships, strong relationships that they have with the academic community. And those are really things that probably, you know, I'm thinking of myself here, we should be taking more advantage of, as well as, you know, maybe on their side of things, incorporating openness and scholarly communications a little bit more. So I think, as Katie said, particularly these days, you know, a lot of that kind of knowledge exchange was very informal, and we probably need to think about how we can make that more formal and explicit and kind of break down those silos a little bit more. One interesting aspect was the you know, incorporating scholarly communication in MLIS training and whatever. And we actually do have a module in UCD. Dr. Laima, I don't know if she's here today actually, runs a module on scholarly communication as part of the MLIS program. And that's quite a relatively recent development, but I think that shows just the importance of scholarly communication now in, you know, all areas of libraries really. So it's great to see developments like that happening, and I think they're really important.
Yeah, I can see in the, I think it looks like that Lai is here as well, so maybe might want to comment in a moment, but I just want to give Hardy a chance to just respond as well to that question, and then we'll open it up to the floor for question. Hardy, anything? I mean, you talked a lot about community as well. I was really struck by that and the role that community plays in organisational change, helping promote sort of the advocacy side of things. But anything from you you'd like to say?
Yeah, well, maybe one point is links with what Michelle said at the beginning of her talk, that we librarians, we are all teachers, but also I think we might, if we want to achieve organizational change, we probably also need to be activists. I think we need to have opinions, and this is sometimes it's quite challenging, because I think that it might not be come natural to us very much. But I think it's something we really need to get more into. So one quick example is that actually happened before I joined NUI Galway, is that our institution was working on a new strategy, and our library lobbied quite intensively on getting the open value into the strategy. And now, so our new plan has 4 institutional values, and one is called Open NUI Galway, and that makes it a lot easier for us to push the open scholarship agenda, saying, you know, we need to do something about this because it's a core value of who we are. And the other point I'd like to make is going to the, you know, models for information literacy. I mean, a lot of what I think our community will do, and hopefully will do, is peer-to-peer teaching. It's, you know, the library will provide the space where, for example, say coding workshops can happen, you know, tools will be shared, GitHub, Open Science Framework, text and data mining. I mean, there's a lot of things where we in the library are not necessarily the experts, but we can bring them together and enable peer-to-peer learning.
Oh, I think those are both really excellent points, actually. And yeah, I've been involved in some conversations at the IFLA level about librarians and their role as activists as well. And I think absolutely there's a real need for some new skills for librarians, because I think, you know, it sounds like quite a scary thing, but actually I think it's something that comes to quite naturally when, you know, we think about why we went into the field and the kind of core values that we have about people needing access to information. So I think that's a really good point, and the point about the peer-to-peer and providing the space for, you know, we aren't always, as you say, not necessarily the experts, but we can bring those people together to run all sorts of workshops and support for researchers. So that's excellent. There was just a couple of other questions that I know that some panel members wanted to sort of highlight, but I'm also conscious of time. So I don't know if we got anything from, I think Niall or Mick were keeping an eye on the Q&A. Have we got any questions from the floor that we might want to take?
There is Jane Niall here. It's for Hardy, and I'm not sure who it's from, but the question is, was the setting up of your open scholarship community at NUIG enhanced by the fact that you could point to being part of the wider international open scholarship community to get your organisation on board with supporting your OSC idea and agenda?
I think initially, probably not. I think the initial excitement was around bringing local enthusiasts together. So I should also say that we are a community for all of Galway. So there are other institutions that we reach out to, not just NUI Galway. I think the feeling that we're part of our international movement that came kind of next when we were approached by our Dutch colleagues. You know, I mentioned the white paper, that was an opportunity, and other things. I think this will only grow. I think this will become more interesting and more important to us when, for example, we can exchange speakers, we can exchange trainers that we all now work from home. I think there's a lot more opportunities now that where we are than we had a year ago. So in a way, the opportunities are getting bigger. So and the importance of the international network will also grow.
Sure.
Okay, so Niall, how are we doing for time as well? I think
we have about 15 minutes.
Okay, so we've got some time if people want to ask questions. So if we open the floor up, and also if the panel members want to have a think about some of the other questions I know that you wanted to talk about. So we had a question about what extent it was of our role to drive change, whether it's about supporting change, and how feasible is it for libraries to contribute to cultural change. Does anyone want to speak to either of those 2 points? I think it might have been Hardy or Katie who suggested those, but do you want to speak to either of those while we wait to see if we've got any more questions come in?
I suppose what we've just been talking about having a role as activists does come down to driving change, but I think there's a real balance. Perhaps it's not an opposition, but we need to also have credibility within the research community, and that means understanding what makes that change difficult, as well as advocating for the change.
Yeah, I can kind of echo that. I think this goes back. I mean, libraries have been discussing this question for a number of years now. If we should step out of our traditional role as custodians of collections, etc., and become partners in research, and also what role do we have there, and are we not losing our focus? And I think there is a danger of a kind of scope creep. But on the other hand, I think if it's not us doing it, who else is doing it? I think that's my point, or that's the situation we have, at least at NUI Galway, that if the library doesn't step up and pushes this agenda, I'm not sure who else from at least the professional services would be. I know some other really good research offices around that are really in that space, and that's great. And I think that can only help us. So I think we need to look locally what the situation is and find our place, but we should be, I think, encouraged to step out of this kind of traditional library model.
Just a thought that occurred to me was that I think librarians actually quite naturally do sit in and it's not, I know there's a lot of controversy around whether we are neutral and, you know, linked with sort of ideas of critical information literacy, and I appreciate none of us are without our biases and are neutral. But I do think in terms of some of the big debates, and we're looking to Samantha here as well and thinking about copyright, and you know, there's been a tradition to see these as very polarized debates, as, you know, open and closed, about copyright protected and, you know, a Creative Commons licensed. And actually, I think that librarians sit in a really unique position where they can actually see this from multiple perspectives. They you know, and perhaps that does mean they could play a really good role as an activist, but an activist that can also you know, perhaps look to see the fact that it is a more complex situation. It's not just a matter of you know, you either want to protect all resources and remunerate, or you know, you want to sort of throw away the keys and open up the library and let everyone in. You know, librarians, I don't know. Samantha, do you want to say anything about that at all?
I think it's a really challenging space. I think partly because at international level, it is extraordinarily acrimonious. And I think this is one of the problems that we have. When we sit in WIPO twice a year during the Standing Committee, where we negotiate international treaties and discuss this with the member states, the relationship between libraries, who are the only people representing the user end, and the rights holders who are feeling attacked by the libraries in this space, because the only discussion is about why everything isn't open. I think that makes it very difficult for then us lower down the chain and individual countries and at individual levels to be able to have these discussions. But I think it's really important, and it's one of the reasons I'm really delighted to be here today. I think this is something that we need to do. And I'm looking at Hardy's examples of the cafes and thinking, can we find people here in the academic community who would take this on in the copyright space? We'd happily provide support and information and identify speakers and help with that, but we can't lead on that because we're outside that space and we are on one side of the perceived coin. I am very much about looking at it in the bigger picture. And one of the things I say to everybody is Creative Commons and open access are based on the principles of copyright law anyway, because the principle is it's an exclusive right to the right holder to allow access whatever way they wish. And that rights holder is the author at the end of the day. The publisher is the producer and is a facilitator, but the rights holder with the exclusive right is the author. And one of the challenges we have in academia is academics don't see themselves in the same space as authors.
No.
And that is something that I would like to see more conversation about. You are authors, you're creating new and original material and making it accessible to people. And that's the definition of an author, whether it's my husband as a poet or you as academics writing papers. It's about communicating your ideas to people and how you get that. So I would like to see a much less polarized space. And I think this is a really good opportunity to do it. There's so much discussion about open, OER, Creative Commons, but also there is, as I say, even if that works perfectly and expands, we have this backlist we want access to, and we need to be able to facilitate that as well. So yeah, if you can find people who are motivated to do stuff, we're here to help. That's all I can say. But I really would like to see less acrimonious discussions around copyright, I think. And we're in a good space, having gone through the Digital Single Market Directive, the new education exceptions are in place in Ireland. We're in a really good space to have that conversation in a more neutral environment. We're not fighting corners at the moment, and that's a really good time to do stuff.
Niall, I see we've got a question, haven't we? I think
we have indeed. We have from Alan Carby, our good friend in UCC, who asks all the panel, and Jane, yourself perhaps. He says, I'm wondering if the panelists have any comments on the notion that any intersections between IL and scholarly communications is actually a library-centric issue, ? I wonder if students, academics, researchers make that distinction and let's charge on with services, offerings, teaching. Or if it is an important distinction, what could that mean in how we present ourselves? So that's to all panelists.
Michelle, would you like to comment on that? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I guess personally, maybe it's because I've worked as a scholarly communications librarian and also an information literacy librarian, that I think it is quite a library-centric distinction, and I'm not sure it's meaningful to a student. You know, they don't see it in like at all. They don't see these divide that we have different units in the library. It's all part of research and teaching and learning. And we're even seeing now, you know, research informed teaching, for example, you know, is growing all the time as well. So I think it's a very artificial like divide that libraries have maybe even created, as Alan I think suggests. So personally, I think, you know, as I guess my talk touched on, you know, incorporating these scholarly communication type topics and openness and open science, I think is everybody's job, information literacy, or, you know, even broader areas within the library. So I would think maybe we need to consider how we do present that and present it in a less fragmented or divided way and a more holistic kind of approach to make it more meaningful and relevant for students as well as our researchers.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I think I really support that idea. That hopefully answered your question, Alan. But I think you do hit the nail on the head there. That actually possibly sometimes, you know, we could even be competing with our colleagues for people's attention, which is obviously not what we intend to do. Katie, did you want to come in? I see you've unmuted. Did you want to respond to that as well?
The question Alan's asked, it reminded me of a challenge that I think is a really useful one to think about, which is that often when we're providing training opportunities and support, it's easy for us to provide them in packages based on what expertise we have as individuals. And so the training sessions end up being packaged according to the expertise of the person running them, rather than putting things together according to the needs of people at particular stages in their learning and their research. And if we can, you know, be covering the same content overall, but arrange it and package it and present it so that it's giving people what they need at different stages in their learning and their career, then that would be that would be what our service users are looking for. It makes it harder perhaps to provide, but I think it's a good way of looking at things.
Okay, Niall, do we have any other questions?
Not at the moment. I don't see anything else in. Actually, I've got a question myself,
okay,
if I may. In terms of driving organizational change or looking at how we do things or cultural change, is the current pandemic an opportunity or an inhibitor, or is it a bit of both, or is it an influential factor at all?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I certainly from my own work, I found I hesitate to call it an opportunity because obviously it's a health crisis. But I think, you know, certainly I have never known so many people to become interested in copyright and online learning, which are the two areas I've spent a long time trying to get people interested in, and finally, you know, perhaps it's you know, reached that sort of tipping point of interest. So that's been my experience. I don't know if panel members would like to comment. Hardy, you haven't said anything for a while. Have you got anything would you like to comment at that point? Is it an opportunity?
Yeah, probably. If I go back to the culture change model, you know, and looking at things like infrastructure and user experience, I think both are much more important at the moment as we all work from home. So that is very much, I think, supporting cultural change. Now, if this is followed up by other things like policies and so on, this remains to be seen. But yes, there is an opportunity in the current crisis.
Anyone else like to comment on that from the panel?
There's a comment from Anya Carey on Alan's question. She says it's important that these topics are covered, but it doesn't need to be distinguished from our user groups and can be confusing when it's done. So I don't know whether Anya wants to comment on that further.
Unmute. Thanks, Niall. No, I was really kind of echoing. I thought Alan's question was excellent, and I think it's a really good reminder for those of us, you know, involved in library practice, that sometimes we don't overcomplicate things, that we have those conversations. And I do think the distinctions are important for us as professionals developing the way ahead. and not, I mean, I really liked Michelle's point earlier about not becoming too siloed in our approach. But at the same time, I think when we're interacting with our user groups, those distinctions don't necessarily need to be made. And the very practical ways Michelle mentioned about providing maybe even just a different perspective when we're doing the normal, if it's a teaching class, normal information literacy instruction, and just embodying some of those different practices will work sufficiently. So I thought Alan hit on a really good point, and I was just sharing that back within the chat. And I do think that, again, like Jane, in terms of the COVID-19 situation, I mean, certainly it raised a lot of issues in terms of access to content. And we know, I suppose, it's probably pushed the discussions we need to have with publishers about the way in which content is managed and kind of tied up in expensive situations. That I think is never going to be the same again in some respects. But I think it also has forced our user groups to move aside from their patterns of, in some cases, overly, for example, relying on print resources and being able to interact with online primary sources, openly available material, interact and use those within the teaching space much more effective. And I've certainly noticed that reflected in the teaching that I've been doing with my academic colleagues, which has been much more collaborative during this time. So again, it's not so much, you know, I think it's been challenging, but I think it has provided opportunities. And I think that is one of the things I would point to in terms of Jane's question about those external drivers. I think COVID has become some of that. So
yeah, I think on your point as well about publishers. I mean, we've had a campaign in the academic community in the UK about ebook licensing, and I think it's an opportunity to raise the you know, that as something with authors, to say, well, if you want to publish textbooks, do have a think about what it says in your contract about how your students will be able to get access to that, because we've all heard the cases of libraries just simply being unable to buy some content for their students. And you know, really, I think it's a huge argument for driving us towards open textbooks, and you know, looking at more sustainable models, because students are not going to be buying print books in the way that, you know, they perhaps were in some sort of previous existence, I feel. I just saw a comment about the sort of point about copyright and authors in an academic environment, and I do think that is an interesting point, that, you know, how academics view themselves, and in fact, you know, in many cases now, because you know, moved towards open access, you know, it is publicly funded research. So although they're writing that up and it's their work, you know, I think we will start to see with Plan S and the rights retention strategy, you know, much more of a change in how, you know, how copyright is managed for academic authors, because of the need to have that research out there. So, you know, I think the pandemic is perhaps speeding up some of the change that has been going on, obviously, for 20 years or so in the community. We've just got a couple of minutes, I think, haven't we, Niall? So any final comments from the panel? Thank you so much for joining me, making this, you know, such an interesting final discussion. I hope people listening have found it useful, and you know, I certainly have, and I'll be going and having a look at Twitter as well later, and following up. It's you know, it's really kind of a lot of the discussions that we were having last December at our event are being kind of, I think, really brought to the forefront today. So I've really enjoyed it. And final comments, panel members, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Before we close the seminar, just some thank yous, and I'm always a little bit nervous about thank yous because I invariably forget somebody. So if I forget somebody in this list, apologies in advance, but there are a few people I need to mention. First of all, our speakers, and I think you'll all agree, have all been exceptionally expert and generous in their talks today, and so kind to stay all morning with us. And most especially Jane Secker, who has been so generous. I'm in awe of her generosity in terms of time and committing to this event, and really, really grateful. And we're grateful to have your expertise, but also your generosity and your accessibility is fantastic to meet you. And also to our colleagues in CILIP, IL Group, Padma and Caroline, who very much helped with this event as well. Conul Research is the first joint event with Conul Research from Conul Teaching and Learning, and I think that's important and based on everything we're talking about all morning. So we'll look at more of that as we go. And thanks to Mick and Michelle Dalton, who's also on the Conul Research Group. Huge thanks to my own group, the Conul Training and Development Group. It's the most exciting group to work with. They're so committed. We've been meeting fortnightly to get this seminar ready, and huge amount of commitment, huge amount of detail, driven especially by Lisa, who is the doyen of detail. So it's incredible work. Also to Julie Barrett, who I'm not sure is with us today, but it was Julie, I think, through a conversation at the end of the Liverpool event with Jane, came back to Ireland very keen that we would have an event based with the Irish context, the Irish perspective. So Julie is very charming, and you don't say no to Julie, and she persuaded me to push ahead with Mick as well. And thanks to all the attendees for coming, and it's an incredibly large amount of people from all kinds of places, so that's wonderful to see. Thanks to UCD for hosting us on Zoom, John Howard for facilitating, Michelle Latimer and for Dermot for their work at having the accessibility correct. And despite the times, we have another seminar coming up to Conul Teaching and Learning Group. We have an annual seminar. Normally it's as somebody referenced earlier, the coffee and biscuits, but we're going to have another virtual event, and it's on digital education in the time of COVID, not the one who sound obsessed with COVID. It's my second reference, and it's on February the 11th. It'll be open to everybody. We'll provide more detail online in the next week or two. So the morning went very fast, and it was very full and very, very wonderful. So thanks to everybody. It's been a pleasure to facilitate the event, and hope to see you all, and keep safe wherever you are, and we'll talk again. Bye bye.